Well, thank you all for staying this late because it is getting towards supper time. And I'm going to talk to you about assessing all these things, multiple dimensions of intercultural and pragmatic competence. And here again, you can see the model that we're working with that has knowledge and analysis, subjectivity, and awareness. We are actually doing this. It is part of an ongoing project that we are working on with Meg Malone and her team at the Assessment and Evaluation LRC at Georgetown, and that should be Center for Applied Linguistics. There's the graphic has gotten bigger. And here is the project in a nutshell. We would like to develop a digital simulation for assessing intercultural communicative competence. In this particular case, we intend to target learners who are students acquiring Korean, ultimately, or Spanish, which is actually what we're working on right at the moment, in a formal educational context. So typical high school or university classroom. The purpose of this assessment is to provide instructors with a profile of their students' intercultural competence. So this is really just to help the instructors understand where their students are at. And then because they maybe have some insight into where their students are at, they can provide their students with an appropriate instructional intervention of some sort. So it's a kind of a low stakes kind of assessment, just to inform your instructors. Well, then we have the first number one big question. If you're going to assess ICC for L2 learners, how do you go about it? And when you look out there for sort of standardized assessments, of the sort that we're, not self-assessments, but assessments of learners' behavior, you know, how are they performing interculturally, you find that such assessments are almost non-existent. And that's not too surprising in a way, because to do this, you would have to address a broad and very ill-defined category. What is ICC? It's, you know, there's 57 models. What is it that we're going to assess? And the whole thing is incredibly complex. You have, just as examples, multiple language varieties. Which one are you going to work with? Learners have individual preferences as to what they might choose to do or say in a particular situation. There's these kinds of assessments are difficult and expensive. So how are you going to go about it? And then, of course, just the bigger question, even if you built one, how would you use the results? I've told you what our result, or how we intend to use the results for ourselves, but you know, you have to think about what are the results going to be used for. That's actually where I think that you start with an assessment, is what is the test purpose? What are you trying to, what's your goal in constructing the test? And there are multiple answers to that, multiple goals that you might have. Every single one of them could entail a different type of assessment. So we're kind of narrowing things down a bit. We're really going to look at L2 pragmatic abilities, which historically have been different in different literatures, different academic disciplines. But really pragmatic, while the pragmatic models are separate from intercultural competence models, they really are interrelated. It's all about being successful in another culture, in another language, knowing what to do and what to say, the right thing at the right time to get done whatever it is you need to do in this particular language. And again, even for just strictly pragmatic sorts of assessments, they're few in number and limited in scope, because it's just a difficult thing to do. Another comment about our kind of pulling together the pragmatic models with the intercultural competence models is that often when something goes wrong in a situation, trying to tease apart, is it pragmatics, is it intercultural ICC in a more traditional sense, is very difficult to know what makes an interaction successful or unsuccessful. Because there are norms, there are patterns, but there's usually, in most situations, no set method for accomplishing a particular task, even as simple a task as greeting. Greetings can be done in an infinite variety of ways, though, of course, there is always the standard, a very simple way, but it may not be the best way for a particular situation. So, what are some of the problems that you get into when you try to go about measuring pragmatic competence? Well, for one thing, you have learner subjectivity. Learners they're agents, and they can choose to deal with situations in their own way. And different learners will have different ways of dealing with a particular situation. And how are you going to assess that? Because assessments typically, the way they have typically been done is you have a question and there's a correct answer and there's an incorrect answer and you're supposed to choose the right one, but you might be in a situation where there are 5 perfectly good ways to do something. The choices are up to the learner or the person in that situation, so how do you measure that? There's also a lack of theoretical support for all these different variations. You also have to deal with all the dialect, sociolect, and we've already kind of touched on the idiolect aspects. All those things matter in every situation, and if you want an assessment that takes it into account, you have some very difficult problems to solve. And one of the things is there's just this lack of a standard for tests to measure pragmatic competency, but in fact, if you standardized the tests, you would eliminate the ability for students to show their subjectivity. I mean, there's kind of a conflict there. You want to standardize tests, but students are supposed to have agency and be able to show that they can deal with situations in their own way. How do you deal with that? I would like to say we have all the answers to this, but we don't. Nonetheless, we're going forward and we're going to build an assessment using the affordances of digital simulations. So what do you get with a digital simulation? Well, for one thing, you get lifelike, in some sense of lifelike scenarios in an immersive digital environment, okay? So it's a little more real than your typical multiple choice question on a paper test. You can allow learners to interact in these simulated spaces, but they're kind of realistic. It's a lot cheaper to actually build a simulation than it is to actually put learners in a real situation and have a live interlocutor to assess them. And we are at this point in history where these emergent technological tools are actually making these kinds of simulations practically attainable. It's still not cheap, but it's possible, and it gets cheaper by the day and easier by the day. So it's time to kind of go jump off the cliff and try it. So let's talk about some of the specific affordances that we get when we start doing these digital simulations. One is we get these extended sequences of conversational turns. That's what real language interactions are like. They're extended. There's several turns, and the real assessment point might take several turns to get to. And so by using these simulations, this immersive situation, you can give the learner this chance to go through a sequence of turns to get to the point where they have to make this pragmatic choice. as to how they're going to handle a situation. Much of what you can do in a simulation is establish context non-linguistically. So in older kind of paper assessments, sometimes you have to spend a lot of time, if you're going to try to get at some of this pragmatic stuff, you have to build a paragraph about the situation so that the learner can understand where they are situationally. But you can do a lot of things just with graphics in this simulated state. You also get standardized interlocutors who can provide systematic variation. And a standardized interlocutor is someone, notice that I've personalized an avatar, which is just a bunch of digital code, but this avatar will be the same for every learner that gets to that point. And there's no human being that can do that. This is actually an advantage, I think, to a digital simulation, because every student is going to, if a student gets to a certain point in a simulation, the avatar will deal with them the same way if they're doing the same thing as the next person. There's no bias, there's no tiredness on the interlocutor's part, and yeah, you can also replay, in some sense of replay, the same kind of situation with different interlocutors. So, for example, you can have you can have avatars who are difficult to deal with. Some avatars can be easy to deal with. Some avatars may be rude. Other avatars may be polite, or formal, or informal. And you can watch the student, the learner here, interact with these different kinds of avatars, which are representing different kinds of people that they might interact with in a real world. Because you're doing these extended sequences of conversational turns, different learners may make different choices at certain points. They take a turn, and after a while they decide to do something different from another learner, and that will then enable the avatar to respond in a different way, and that will take the learner down a different interactional pathway. So it's kind of like a game. These simulations have a game-like quality, even though they're assessments. And some students will go down one pathway, and some will go down another pathway. There's certainly, in the beginning stages here, there's a restriction in the number of pathways that one can create at this point, but there are multiple pathways that you can go down to get through the assessment. There's also the possibility of making nonverbal responses at some points, because you can write into the simulation, you could give the learner the possibility of slamming the door in somebody's face, or turning and leaving a room, or something like that. And it is a restricted set, but you can give the learners just a set of possibilities of things. They could reply, they could leave, they could do a number of things. It depends on just what kind of conversation they're having in this simulated space. And one thing that's really kind of cool about simulations is you can stop the action, which is not really possible with real human beings. You can stop the action after something has happened, and you can ask the learner specifically to comment on the interaction that they have had with the avatar at that point. And at that point, you find out what kind of awareness do they have about what just happened. Do they know that they have just insulted the avatar? And did they do it on purpose? I mean, it's that kind of thing. You can ask them to reflect on what just happened in the simulation. Also, a very nice thing if you want to do research is with a simulation, it's all happening digitally. Every click and movement that the learner makes is recorded. You have continuous data collection which you can process to your heart's content. So that's not something you get in more traditional, or at least in paper assessments. They try to make you show your work on a math test to see the sequence of moves that you went through to get the answer. And this is like every second, you're getting data recorded, so it's even better. Okay, and there are some of the references for that. Okay, so here is a bit about our approach. We wanted to design the assessment based on our framework, which we've been talking about, of intercultural pragmatic competence. And we wanted to aim to assess the learner's ability to express and interpret meaning in these situationally appropriate ways. And again, there's just a small part of the literature that we consulted in trying to solve this problem. The design principles that we have taken to heart are that we want to make allowance for an individualized experience, which is validated across learners. So we're going to need to have a lot of different kinds of people work through this and therefore provide typical validation that you would expect in an assessment kind of situation. We're looking at the examination of a set of macro-level skills that would interface with other linguistic abilities. So it's not trying to get away from, vocabulary and grammar and that sort of thing, but looking at these kind of skills at a pragmatic level. And we want to also have the capability of adeptness in considering language variation. Some of the assumptions we're working with are that interactions are co-constructed. It is a little bit here, you're co-constructing with an avatar, but nonetheless, from inside the learner, it's somewhat functioning realistically as if with a human being. The assessments can provide information about the learner's ability in multiple domains. So you can do the same kind of function, such as a greeting or making a request or something like that, in a variety of different kinds of domains under a variety of different kinds of circumstances. And we feel that none of these things are going to be reducible to a single score, which is why our goal is a profile. Maybe you can handle these kind of interactions under certain situations, but not under other situations. And ideally, we want to develop a lot of situations in order to provide assessments and provide a profile to instructors as to how their students are doing. And we also, for what we're doing here, we are assuming that skills are distinguishable from attitudes, and attitudes are not part of the construct that we are assessing. So attitudes are important. We're not trying to minimize that, but here what we're assessing is observable behavior. And there are other ways to get at internal attitudes, and you really need different approaches to those things. So we're looking at the external behavior. The learner profile that we will this is the result, the score, but we call it a learner profile, will provide information about learners' abilities on dimensions critical to successful multicultural interaction, just what we've been talking about. It will be based on the evidence that we've gathered across a variety of dimensions in multiple scenarios. So in the end, we want to have a variety of scenarios that have within each one different, how should I put this? Scenarios in which you actually have to do the same thing several times, but with different kinds of interlocutors. You might have I'll show you an example here towards the end, but you might have a scenario in which you're going to have a service encounter, and you might have it with someone who is more cooperative, and then you might have it with someone that's uncooperative. You might encounter different kinds of complications, but there would be these multiple sets of scenarios that would give evidence for building out this learner profile. Okay, So we're back to the framework that you've been seeing for the last hour or so. And it's just to remind you of the 4 dimensions. Notice that on the left side, those are kind of analytical sort of things. And on the right side are the more affective sort of dimensions of, and I'll work through each of those and give you examples of how we're thinking of it, and then show you it in an example. Okay, so when we're trying to assess the learner's knowledge, what we're trying to see is that the learner recognizes and produces varying speech styles. And so in a very simple way, you know, formal versus informal speech would be, depending on the language, would be one of those kinds of things. We would want to see that they identify and produce routine formulae in multiple dimensions, as we've been talking about, and that they interpret and produce implicature in multiple domains, that they understand the implicature that they're facing, and that they demonstrate knowledge of varying cultural dimensions and social distinctions. So this is just kind of knowledge about cultural differences and how to deal with them differently in the particular language that they're studying. In terms of analysis, what we're looking for is to see if the learner uses conscious strategies to compare miscommunication. So for example, did they know that they did something wrong in this encounter, in the sense that they might have insulted somebody, and they might have wanted to, but if they, or somebody as somebody avatar, if they know that, are they going to try to repair the communication, because it's important for whatever scenario they are in to try to make amends for something in order to get what they need to get based on the scenario. Perhaps they need to buy something and they've just insulted the proprietor. Are they going to try to repair it? Or are they unconscious of the fact that they've made an insult? We'd look to see if they can identify and evaluate these the intended interlocutor meaning. So the avatar might say something. Do they get it? Do they understand the meaning? Do they understand what they said? Also, we'll be looking to see if they can describe dimensions impacting discourse patterns, just that they know that how they behave matters. In the area of subjectivity, we're looking to see if the student demonstrates the ability to make conscious choices about discourse patterns and behaviors. This is from their side of it. Do they themselves choose to act in a particular way that they feel comfortable with? And on the other side of it, do they recognize when the avatar uses a particular pattern, a particular bit of discourse, do they recognize individual personality behaviors, and are they able to separate those from cultural norms? So, you know, can they discern that this is not just the way everybody in this culture says this, but is this something peculiar to this avatar, which is what personality, it always sounds a little funny to talk about personality when you're talking about an avatar, but we give our avatars personality. And in the dimension of awareness, what we're looking at is to see whether the learner demonstrates awareness of others' perspectives. So do they understand that what they did might have been offensive, or that it might have, you know, from the other person's point of view? It's that kind of thing. And do they recognize the motives and reasons for actions in their own self? So I'm going to really quickly, in the last few minutes, go through an example of a scenario. I've been kind of hinting at them as we've gone through this, but we'll take just this kind of one example scenario from Spanish. And the task for the learner in this scenario is to apologize for being late to meet a friend. Keeping in mind that different friends respond in different ways, the context of each apology is different, Different learner choices lead to different pathways through the simulation. Some apologies won't be accepted by your friends. And choices are not dichotomous, but relative to the situation and speakers, just like language and culture always is. So in this example, they need to know, for example, that in Spanish, hero-oriented strategies are preferred by expert speakers, as in perdóname or discúlpame with an explanation. Saying lo siento is better than nothing, but not really counting as an apology. In terms of analysis, they would need to understand that the strategy chosen, whichever kind of strategy they choose for completing this linguistic task, is going to be determined by pre and post mitigators. So there would be how much you apologize depends on how great an offense it is that you've committed, and how do you carry out an appropriate apology in that situation. On the other hand, learners have subjectivity, and they might consciously choose not to apologize. And that should be an option. And you're not necessarily non-proficient, because you choose deliberately not to apologize. Sometimes in assessments, it's like, well, there's this one way to do it. No. You can just deliberately decide that you're not going to apologize because they should just accept it or whatever. If you can state that you know what you're doing. So the learner can choose this strategy, but whatever choices you make in the simulation, just as in life, there's going to be consequences. Your friend may not accept your apology or your lack of it, or they may not be friends with you anymore after that. But the ability, again, here's the example with awareness. You can stop the action, and the speaker can explain why it was effective or not. They could explain how it was effective or how it was ineffective. After the fact, consider the event and think of why or why not. So that would be some of the things that you could do with awareness. So using this approach, students' answers have interactional consequences within the assessment itself, just as in real life. Students can demonstrate their ability to negotiate the twists and turns of conversation, as is what they need to do in real life, and they can interact in ways that are consistent with their own individuality. In conclusion, I have to say, I was personally involved in this, that creating an assessment of intercultural competence is challenging. There should be a number of exclamation points after that, because it's challenging in the extreme. That approaches, I do believe, utilizing simulations can ameliorate a lot of the difficulties that have been seen in the past attempts to assess this. And data simulations such as this one are a novel approach to language assessment, and the framework that we present here represents an initial effort, and I'm sure there will be changes as we go along, but that's where we're at right now. So I thank you.